She smiled through every insult, nodded through every public humiliation. Let them call her a foreign dog who stumbled into a crown she didn't deserve. For 7 years, Queen Serafina Valamont kept her mouth shut and her eyes open. And while the court laughed at her silence, she was writing down every name, every lie, every stolen coin, and every covered-up murder. They thought they were watching a woman break. They had no idea they were watching a dynasty die. Stay until the end. You will not see this coming. Drop your city in the comments and hit that like button. Let me know where in the world you're watching a queen burn an empire down from the inside. The first snow of the season hit the capital of Thornvale 3 days before the winter feast, and by the time the carriages rolled through the iron gates of the palace, the courtyard stones had turned the color of old bone. Serafina stood at the upper window of the east corridor and watched them arrive. Lords and ladies from every province, their breath fogging in the cold air, their furs expensive and their manners theatrical. She had learned to read them the way a tracker reads ground, not by what was visible, but by the weight of what pressed down underneath. Who walked close to whom? Who avoided whose gaze? Who laughed too quickly when a certain name was mentioned? She had been doing this for 7 years. Her handmaid, Dessa, a short woman from the Thornvale lowlands with ink-stained fingers and a talent for moving through rooms without being noticed, appeared at her shoulder with a folded square of parchment. "From the steward's office," Dessa said quietly. "Seating arrangement for tonight." Serafina took it without looking away from the courtyard. "And my placement?" A beat of hesitation that told her everything before Dessa opened her mouth. "Far end of the secondary table, Your Majesty. Lord Brennick is seated at the king's right hand, Lady Morwen Cassiel directly to his left." Serafina finally looked down at the parchment. Her name was listed 7th. Below 3 men who held no actual military rank, and 1 woman who had publicly referred to her accent as the sound a cat makes when it falls into a well at last spring's garden party. She folded the parchment along its existing crease, set it on the windowsill. "Send no correction," she said. "I'll sit where they put me." Dessa looked like she wanted to argue. She was loyal, and she was young, and loyalty combined with youth had a way of making people believe that a visible response to disrespect was the same thing as dignity. Serafina had spent years understanding that it was not. "Yes, Your Majesty." "And bring me the ledger, the blue one, not the red," Dessa said. The blue ledger was not what it appeared. On the surface, it was a household accounting book, the kind kept by any diligent noblewoman managing staff and supply costs for a large estate. The handwriting was small and consistent, the columns organized, the figures accurate. If any of the king's advisors had opened it, and 2 of them had tried, though they didn't know she knew this, they would have found nothing but numbers. What they would not have found was the second layer of notation embedded in the margin annotations. Written in a compressed cipher she had developed herself over the course of 3 years, borrowing structure from a trade language used by merchants in her home province of Aldenmere. The annotations referenced dates, names, and transactions, not household transactions, the other kind. She sat at her writing desk with the ledger open and her dinner preparation interrupted and added 3 new entries from memory. The first concerned a meeting she had not been present at, but which Dessa had overheard while carrying linens past a partially open door on the 4th floor of the East Wing. 2 of the king's cousins, Lord Farrak Thornvale and his younger brother Casto, had discussed a wool trade route running through the southern provinces. Except wool was not moving through those roads in winter, and the governor of the Southern Way Station had reported to his own staff, in a letter that had passed through 3 hands before reaching Serafina, that the only cargo he had processed in the past 6 weeks was grain and iron. Iron. In quantities that did not match any military order she could find documentation for. The second entry concerned Lady Morwen Cassiel's personal accountant, who had dismissed 2 staff members in the same week and paid both of them a severance that was triple the customary amount. The third was simpler. 2 days prior, Serafina had stood in the hall outside the king's private study and listened to her husband's chief advisor, a man named Colum Drever, who wore rings on every finger and smelled of cedar oil, tell the king that the foreign queen was becoming a point of embarrassment at diplomatic gatherings, and that perhaps arrangements should be considered. Arrangements. She had not moved from that hallway for a long moment after Drever's footsteps faded, not because she was afraid, because she was calculating. Then she walked to her desk and opened the blue ledger. The winter feast began at the 7th bell. Serafina dressed without ceremony, dismissing the 2 additional handmaids who had been assigned to her specifically for formal events. She did not want help. She did not want attendants hovering, adjusting fabric, making small admiring sounds that would be reported later in the servants' gossip network that fed directly into certain ears at court. She wore deep green, a color from Aldenmere that the Thornvale court had once openly mocked as swamp water fashion. She wore it because it was hers, and because the refusal to perform apology was its own kind of statement, one that required no words and left no evidence. Her hair she pinned herself, a style her mother had taught her, the kind of complicated knot that looked simple and was not. She was one of the last to arrive in the Great Hall, which was intentional. She had learned early that arriving first gave others the advantage of positioning, of filling the room with their social architecture before she could map it. The hall was already loud. 300 people, give or take, arranged across the long tables in configurations that were supposed to reflect the natural social order of the kingdom, but actually reflected something more specific. Who currently owed what to whom? The chandeliers burned hot, and the smell of roasted meat and mulled wine had already turned the air thick. Serafina moved through it without hurrying. She passed Lord Brennick first, who was already installed at the king's right hand as Dessa had reported, his broad shoulders taking up the space of a man who had never once in his life been asked to make himself smaller. He had a laugh like something being dragged over gravel, and he was using it at full volume, directed at a cluster of younger lords who were competing to be the most entertained. He did not acknowledge her as she passed. She did not require him to. She found her seat at the 7th position on the secondary table and sat down, and the woman to her left, a minor baroness from the northern provinces named Elise Carn, who had always maintained a cautious neutrality towards Serafina that she appreciated, gave her a small nod that carried more warmth than most of the formal greetings she received. "You look well," Elise said quietly. "You're kind," Serafina answered, which was not agreement or denial, only acknowledgement. The evening began to unspool the way these evenings always did. The food came in waves, the wine moved faster than the food. Toasts were made, to the king's health, to the kingdom's prosperity, to several victories and border skirmishes that had happened 2 years ago and were apparently still worth celebrating monthly. King Aldrich sat at the head of the primary table and received all of it with the expression of a man who had never once doubted his own position at the center of anything. He was not a cruel man, Serafina had decided a long time ago. He was something more dangerous, a comfortable one. A man for whom power was so natural, so unexamined, that he had no system for detecting when it was being used badly around him. He trusted people because trusting people had never cost him anything he couldn't afford to lose. He ignored evidence because the evidence had never yet forced itself past the wall of his own convenience. She had loved him once, not the way the songs described love, not the collision of celestial bodies or the burning fever, but she had respected him, and she had believed he respected her. And in the early years of their marriage, she had believed that respect would hold. It had not held. She watched him now from the far end of the secondary table, noting the way he leaned toward Lord Brennick when Brennick spoke, the way his expression shifted from tolerant to genuinely engaged. Aldrich believed Brennick was funny. He believed Brennick was loyal. He believed Brennick was the kind of straightforward, uncomplicated man that a king needed close to him. Brennick was skimming 6% off every grain contract that passed through his province and had been doing so for 4 years. Serafina knew this because she had compared the shipping manifests from 3 separate merchant families against the official treasury records, and the discrepancy was not subtle. It was the discrepancy of a man who had stopped worrying about being caught. That was the thing about rot. It moved slowly and then all at once. The insult came from across the primary table, delivered during a lull in the music when the hall had gone momentarily quieter. Lord Casto Thornvale, younger of the 2 brothers she'd been tracking, raised his goblet in the direction of the secondary table with a grin that had too many teeth in it. "Tell me, does anyone know if the Queen's home country celebrates winter, or do they just huddle in their swamps and wait for the smell to improve?" The laughter was not universal. But it was loud enough to matter. Serafina lifted her own cup, unhurried. Let the moment breathe. Looked at Casto Thornvale with the expression she had perfected over 7 years. Not blankness, which would have read as injury, but a kind of clear-eyed detachment. The look of a woman watching something predictable happen on schedule. Aldenmere has 3 distinct winter traditions, she said, her voice carrying without effort. All of them older than your family's claim to that title. But I wouldn't expect you to know that, Lord Casto. You've never shown particular interest in things that require reading. The silence lasted 2 full seconds. Then a few of the minor lords at the edges laughed. The nervous kind, the kind that comes from not knowing which way the power is leaning. Casto's grin tightened. Sharp tongue on a queen who can't even produce an heir for 7 years. She heard the collective intake, felt Elise Carn go very still beside her. Serafina set her cup down, looked at Casto for a moment longer than was comfortable. 7 years, she repeated pleasantly. I've kept count, too. It's a useful number. She turned back to her food. The exchange would be discussed in the morning. She knew how these things moved through the court's social body, how a queen's response to humiliation became either confirmation of weakness or data point in a more complicated picture. She had learned to let people draw their own conclusions for longer than was comfortable. The picture took time to develop. Rushing it ruined it. Under the table, her right hand rested in her lap. She pressed 2 fingers against her palm, not hard enough to bruise, just enough to feel the pressure. It was a habit she'd developed early in the marriage, a small anchor against the current of her own rage, which she had also learned to regard as information rather than instruction. Rage told her, Casto Thornvale is reckless and secure. He says things like that in a room full of people because no one has ever made saying things like that cost him anything. That was useful. The music resumed. The feast moved into its later hours. Serafina ate and drank moderately, and spoke when spoken to, and watched. She watched Lord Farrick Thornvale excuse himself from the table at the same moment that Colum Drever, the chief advisor with the cedar oil smell, stepped out through a side door. The timing had the quality of a rehearsed accident, 2 men leaving a room in the same direction without appearing to leave together. She had seen this particular choreography 3 times in the past month. She watched Lady Morwen Cassiel spend 45 minutes in close conversation with a man Serafina had not seen at court before. Middle years, well-dressed, but not lavishly so. The kind of forgettable appearance that was occasionally intentional. When Morwen laughed at something he said, she touched his wrist with 2 fingers. Not a flirtation, a reassurance. She watched King Aldrich watch none of this. She watched a young page boy deliver a sealed note to Lord Brennick, who read it, folded it twice, and slipped it into his jacket without changing expression. Brennick had received 6 such notes in the past 3 weeks. She knew because she had made note of each one, and because Dessa was very good at her work. By the time the feast wound toward its conclusion, Serafina had added 7 more mental notations to entries she would transfer to the blue ledger before she slept. 7 years of this, and the picture was nearly complete. She found the king in his receiving room after the guests had dispersed, standing before the fire with a cup in one hand and the other braced on the mantel. The room smelled of smoke and wool and the particular kind of exhausted silence that follows a long performance. He looked up when she entered. His expression did something complicated that resolved into something closer to guilt than she'd seen from him in a while. Casto was out of line tonight, Aldrich said. Not an apology. A statement delivered in the tone of a man acknowledging weather. He usually is, she answered. I'll speak to him. You've said that before. A pause. The fire snapped. Serafina, I'm not angry, she said, which was both true and not the whole truth. I'm tired. There's a difference, and I need you to hear it. He turned to face her more fully. Aldrich Thornvale was a large man, broad through the chest, with the kind of face that had probably been striking at 20 and had since settled into something heavier and more complicated. There were moments, fewer now than before, but still present, when she could see in him the man she had chosen. The man who had told her, the night before their wedding, that he wanted a partner, not an ornament, that he wanted to hear what she thought about things, that he found her mind interesting, that Thornvale needed what she brought from Aldenmere. She wondered sometimes where that man had gone. She had concluded, eventually, that he hadn't gone anywhere. He was still here. He had simply discovered that having a partner required cost, and that the cost was specifically the discomfort of his own court, and that the discomfort of his own court was, in the final calculation, more proximate than she was. "You could have defended me tonight," she said. "In the moment. That's all it would have required. One sentence from you." He looked at the fire. "It would have made a scene." "It already was a scene, Aldrich. The question is only who directs it." He didn't answer. She watched the muscle in his jaw work once, the specific motion of a man processing something he didn't want to process. "Casto is volatile," he said finally. "If I correct him publicly, he digs in. You know how he is." "I know exactly how he is," she said. The words landed differently than he expected. She watched him try to locate the edge in them and fail. "What does that mean?" "It means I've been paying attention." She held his gaze. "I've been paying close attention for a very long time, Aldrich. To your brothers, your cousins, your advisors, to the way things move through this court that perhaps shouldn't move the way they do." He was quiet for a moment. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not alarm, not quite. Something closer to wariness. "That sounds like an accusation of something. It's an observation." "Serafina." He set his cup down. "Whatever you think you've noticed." "I think you should be careful about finishing that sentence," she said, her voice still even, "because the sentence you're about to say ends with you telling me that I've misunderstood something, and you don't know yet what I know." The fire was the loudest thing in the room for a long moment. Aldrich studied her. She let him look. She had spent 7 years being looked at by people who thought looking at her was the same as seeing her, and she had spent that time understanding the difference. "We should sleep," he said. "We can speak more in the morning." "Of course," she said. She turned to leave, paused at the door. "Aldrich, those grain shipments running through Brennick's southern routes in autumn, do you know what was actually loaded on those wagons?" He went very still. "I ask," she continued, her hand on the door frame, her voice carrying no particular emphasis, "because the official records say wool, but I've spoken with 3 separate merchants who were present at the way station. They say iron. Quite a lot of it. No military order on record for any of it." She paused one beat. "Sleep well." She left him standing in front of the fire. Totin. The corridor outside the receiving room was quiet, lit by oil lamps that guttered slightly in a draft from somewhere. Serafina walked it slowly, not hurrying, each footstep deliberate on the cold stone. Dessa was waiting at the intersection point they had established, a specific corner 3 turns from the Queen's chambers, close enough to the servants' stairs to look like an accidental crossing if observed by the wrong person. "Well?" Serafina said. Dessa fell into step beside her. "The man Lady Cassiel met with tonight. His name is Torvin Ald. He arrived in the capital 4 days ago. His official business is listed as textile imports, but he paid for his lodgings at the Crown and Arrow in gold coin. 2 months paid in full, in advance." Textile merchants didn't pay 2 months in advance in full and in gold. They paid incrementally, the way people who moved money carefully always did. "Who else knows his name?" "No one in the court's official records. He didn't register through the usual channels." Then someone walked him in through a side arrangement. She moved through the corridor. "Find out who vouched for him at the gate." "Already started," Dessa said. "One more thing." She lowered her voice even further, though they were alone. Ferreck Thornvale's man, the one who handles his private correspondence, was seen this evening moving 2 crates from the East Wing storage to a private carriage on the rear service road. The carriage wasn't registered in the palace vehicle log. Serafina slowed her pace slightly. Unregistered carriage, private correspondence handler. Moving physical material at night during a feast, when the palace's attention was concentrated in one room. She calculated. They were moving something, or preparing to move something. And the timing, the feast, the guest list, the managed chaos of 300 people consuming too much wine in an enclosed space, the timing was chosen. Not coincidence, operational. Which direction did the carriage go? East Road. East Road ran toward the border province, toward the way station that had processed the iron. "I need you to go to General Harwick's aid tonight," Serafina said. "Not in the morning. Tonight. You know the protocol." Dessa's expression didn't change. This was not their first activation of this kind of request. "Message or meeting?" "Message only. 3 words. He'll know what they mean." She stopped in front of her chamber door, turned to face Dessa directly. "Make sure you aren't followed." "I never am," Dessa said. Serafina almost smiled. "I know. That's why I trust you." She went inside. The blue ledger was on her desk where she'd left it. She lit 2 candles, sat down, and opened it to the current page. The notation she added took 20 minutes. She was thorough. She always was. The cipher was consistent. The margin annotations cross-referenced against existing entries with small symbols she had designed herself. When she finished, she did not close the ledger immediately. She sat for a moment with her hands flat against the open pages and looked at what 7 years had built. The picture had been developing slowly, then faster, then in the past 4 months faster still. The pattern had a shape now, not a loose web of individual corruptions. She'd understood each piece of that for a long time. What she was looking at now was a structure, coordinated, intentional, the kind of thing that didn't grow by accident. Someone was organizing it. Not Brennick. He was a beneficiary, not an architect. Not Casto Thornvale, who was too reckless to manage anything at this scale. Farrick was more careful. Farrick had the patience. But Farrick had also, in every interaction she had observed, deferred. Not the deference of a subordinate. The deference of a man who knew where the actual center of gravity was. The man with cedar oil smell. Colum Drever, whose rings caught the light and whose voice never rose above a certain controlled register, and who had, on the night she stood outside the king's study, told Aldrich that arrangements should be considered. She had wondered then what arrangements meant. She had spent the subsequent months finding out. She closed the ledger, pushed it to the back of the desk and covered it with 2 other documents, as she always did. From the narrow window above her writing desk, she could see a corner of the palace's rear courtyard. The service road was dark. The carriage was gone. She stood at that window longer than she intended, watching the dark courtyard, calculating timelines and distances, and the weight of what she now knew against the weight of what she still needed to confirm before she moved. Because moving too early was the same as not moving at all. She had watched Thornvale's court destroy people who had reached for power before they had enough of it in hand, and she had no intention of making that error, not after 7 years, not after everything. She was still at the window when Dessa returned, breathless, from the general's aide's quarters. One look at Dessa's face told her the message had not been received the way she expected. "He wouldn't take it," Dessa said, and her voice had a quality in it that Serafina had not heard from her before. "Harwick's aide refused?" "He wasn't there." Dessa's jaw was tight. "His quarters were empty. The neighbors said he packed a bag 3 days ago and left. No explanation, no notice." Harwick's aide. One of 6 people Serafina had spent 4 years cultivating as part of her network, the first she had recruited, the one she had trusted most completely as a relay point to the general himself. Gone. 3 days ago. She stood in the center of her room and felt the full weight of it settle. Someone knew about the network, not everything. If they knew everything, the response would not be a quietly emptied room. The response to everything would have been something she never came back from. But they knew enough, which meant the question was not anymore about whether to move. The question was about how much time she had left before the next piece of her network disappeared, or before whoever was doing the clearing decided that a quietly evacuated aid was not sufficient. She looked at Dessa. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "I need you to go to the market district, the fabric merchant on Callan Street, the one who supplies the palace. You've been before, you know the route. You'll ask for blue cloth, not green, not red. Blue." Dessa understood the code. "And if the answer is there's none in stock, then we are out of time." Serafina turned back to the window. Outside, the courtyard was still. The night was still. But the stillness had a different quality now, the quality of a thing that was about to stop being still. "And we move without the general." In the corridor outside her door, something shifted. The quality of sound changed. Not footsteps exactly, but the absence of the particular silence she was accustomed to, replaced by a presence that pressed differently against the edges of the door. She turned her head toward it. Dessa heard it too. The girl's eyes went to the door, then back to Serafina. 7 years of patience. 7 years of documentation and careful recruitment and measured silence and every insult absorbed like water into stone. 7 years of being underestimated by people who confused her stillness with emptiness. If someone was standing outside that door, they had made the same mistake. She crossed to her desk in 3 steps, removed the blue ledger from its hiding place beneath the other documents, and handed it to Dessa. "You know where it goes," she said. "Yes." "Go now. Out the servants' passage." Dessa took it without hesitation, moved to the back wall. The passage entrance was disguised, a panel that matched the stonework, the kind of architectural detail that appeared in older wings of the palace and was rarely mapped in current building records. Serafina had found it in her 2nd year. She had told no one except Dessa. The panel opened. Dessa slipped through. The panel closed. Serafina stood in the center of her room. She smoothed her dress with both hands, adjusted her hair, which was still pinned in the knot her mother had taught her. Then she turned toward the door and waited. The knock came 3 seconds later. 2 sounds, sharp, formal, the knock of an official, not a servant. She let it sit for one more breath. Then she opened it. 2 guards stood in the corridor, not palace household guards, the ones who had been outside her door for 7 years. These were different. She recognized the insignia on their coats, the private retinue of Colm Drever's household. Behind them, holding a lamp and wearing the careful expression of a man who had prepared what he was going to say very thoroughly, stood Drever himself. "Your Majesty," he said, "I apologize for the hour. His Majesty the King has asked that I escort you to the North Tower for your own safety. There appears to be a security concern within the palace." She studied him. Security concern. The phrase was chosen well. It implied she was being protected rather than moved. "How kind," she said, her voice entirely level. "And what nature of security concern would require me to leave my chambers in the middle of the night?" Drever's smile was the smile of a man who had outmaneuvered people before and understood the particular pleasure of it. "The kind," he said, "that your Majesty's presence here would only complicate." She looked at him for a long moment. The blue ledger was gone. Dessa was gone. The network was compromised but not destroyed, and Colm Drever was standing in her doorway with 2 of his private guards, smiling the smile of a man who had already decided how this ended. He had no idea, not the smallest idea, that she had spent 7 years preparing specifically for the night someone came to her door and told her she was a complication. "Of course," she said, and stepped forward. "Lead the way." The North Tower was not a prison. That was the first thing Serafina understood as Drever's guards moved her through the palace's back corridors, past the kitchens and the storage rooms, and the long servants' passage that connected the east wing to the central keep. A prison would have been simpler. A prison had defined terms. What Drever was doing was something more surgical. He was removing her from the social body of the palace the way a surgeon removes a splinter. Quietly, without announcement, in a way that could be explained later as concern rather than containment. She walked between the 2 guards and did not resist and did not speak, and used the silence to think. The North Tower had 3 levels. The upper 2 were largely unused, storage mostly, tapestries and furniture that had been rotated out of active rooms. The lower level had 2 small rooms that had served, at various points in Thornvale's history, as private quarters for guests who required a degree of separation from the main court. Comfortable enough. Isolated enough. The kind of place where a person could be kept without the word kept ever needing to be used. Drever walked ahead of them, his lamp cutting a moving circle of light through the corridor dark. He had not spoken again since the doorway. She watched the back of his head, the way he carried his shoulders. Not tense, not performing ease either. Just the particular relaxed quality of a man inside a plan that was going the way he expected it to go. He did not know about the ledger. If he knew about the ledger, this walk would feel different. He would be moving faster. There would be more guards. The quality of containment would be urgent rather than procedural. Instead, it had the unhurried quality of a man who had neutralized a threat he considered already managed. He knew about the network. He knew about Harwick's aid. He did not yet know the full extent of what she had built, which meant he had found one thread and pulled it and believed the thread was the whole thing. That was his mistake. It was the same mistake all of them had been making for 7 years. The stairwell to the North Tower was narrow, stone, the kind of architecture that made sound travel strangely. Drever's footsteps preceded them up the spiral, and his lamp threw their shadows long against the curved walls. "Here," he said at the lower level door. The room beyond it was what she had expected: a bed, a table, 2 chairs, a small fireplace that was not currently lit, a window that looked out over the north wall's exterior, too high to reach anything useful, too narrow for more than a person's arm. One of the guards set a lamp inside. Drever remained in the doorway. "Someone will bring wood for the fire," he said, "and something to eat if you're hungry." "I'm not," she said. "Am I free to leave in the morning?" His expression did not change. "That depends on several things." "What things?" He tilted his head slightly, the gesture of a man deciding how direct to be. "His Majesty will speak with you tomorrow. Until then, it's best you remain comfortable here." She looked at him for a long moment, let him hold her gaze. "Call him?" she said, using his first name for the first time in 7 years of knowing him. The effect was visible, a small tightening at the corner of his eye. "Whatever you think you know about me, you are not yet at the end of that information." He smiled. It was a careful smile, the smile of a man who had heard threatening statements from people who couldn't follow through on them and had learned to calibrate the difference. "Sleep well, Your Majesty," he said. He pulled the door shut. She heard the bolt slide home from the outside. She did not sleep. She sat in one of the chairs and watched the unlighted fireplace and ran through every variable she could access. The ledger was with Dessa. Dessa knew the secondary route, not to Harwick's aide, who was gone, but to a woman named Petra Solins who ran a cloth importing business on the eastern edge of the market district and who had been, for the past 2 years, the second relay point in Serafina's network. Petra did not know the full scope of what she was part of. She knew only that certain deliveries came to her store and that she held them until a specific person came to collect. The specific person who had come for the ledger was a man named Counselor Vane, who sat on the kingdom's trade commission and who had, 16 months ago, brought Serafina evidence of treasury irregularities in the form of 3 ledger pages he had quietly copied from documents he was not supposed to have seen. Vane was the closest thing she had to an active ally inside the institutional structure of the kingdom's governance. The question was whether Drever had gotten to him too. She pressed 2 fingers against her palm, felt the pressure, thought about probability rather than fear, because fear was information that wanted to become instruction, and she could not afford to let it do that tonight. She thought about the centennial celebration. 4 months away. The largest gathering in the kingdom's calendar year. 3 days of events, thousands of attendees from every province, representatives from 4 neighboring kingdoms, all of them concentrated in the capital. It had been in her mind as a target date for a long time, the point at which the maximum number of people would be present to witness something that could not be quietly buried or reframed. 4 months. She needed to be out of this room, and she needed her network to hold, and she needed Drever to continue believing he had the situation managed. She could work with 4 months. The king came himself in the morning, which surprised her. She had expected a proxy, another message, another managed communication filtered through Drever's careful hands. Instead, Aldrich arrived with only 1 guard, and dismissed even that guard at the door, and came into the room alone with the look of a man who had not slept either and was not trying to hide it. He looked at her sitting in the chair. She looked at him standing in the doorway. "Sit down, Aldrich," she said. "You look terrible." He laughed once, short and without humor, and sat in the other chair. The fireplace between them had been lit at some point in the early morning. It was burning low now. "Drever told me there was a security concern," he said. "Drever told you what he wanted you to hear." A muscle moved in his jaw. "He has information about a network of contacts you've been building without my knowledge. He says I'm a threat," she said. And rather than asking me directly what I've been doing and why, you let him move me to the North Tower in the middle of the night. The silence that followed had a specific quality, the quality of a man who recognized an accusation that was accurate and was trying to locate a response that was not simply confirmation. "What have you been doing?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment. This was the question she had been preparing to answer, and also the question she had been trying to decide whether to answer honestly, partly honestly, or not at all. The calculation depended on what Aldrich was, whether he was still the man from the early years of their marriage, the one who had said he wanted a partner, or whether he had completed his transformation into something that prioritized his own comfort above the point where he could not be reached. She made a decision. "I've been documenting corruption," she said, "inside your court, inside your family. The kind of corruption that is dismantling this kingdom from inside the walls while you attend feasts and award titles and listen to Colm Drever tell you what he thinks you need to know." Aldrich's breathing changed. She noticed it, the slight deepening, the quality of a man bracing. "That's a significant claim." "It is. I have 7 years of evidence to support it." "Evidence?" "Yes." She held his gaze. "Do you want to know what's on those wagons moving through Brennick's province? Because it isn't wool. I told you that last night, and you stood in front of your fire and let me walk out the door rather than ask the next question." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Iron?" She did not show her surprise. "You knew." "I suspected." He pressed one hand against the arm of the chair. Drever explained it as a precautionary measure, surplus from border skirmishes, being repositioned for storage. Without a military order number, without treasury documentation, without any record in the official logs. He didn't answer. "Aldrich." Her voice was level. She was done with warmth in this moment because warmth would let him stay comfortable, and comfort was what had brought them here. "Where is iron stockpiled in quantity, without documentation used for?" He knew. She could see it in his face, the thing he had refused to follow to its conclusion because the conclusion was incompatible with the life he had constructed. "Who is it for?" she said. "Ask the question out loud." "Sarah?" "Say it." "Drever." The word came out flat, stripped of everything except its weight. "Or someone Drever is working with." "Your brother Ferric," she said, "who has been meeting with Drever privately on a schedule I can document going back 14 months. And a man named Torvin Alde, who arrived in the capital 4 days ago with no official registration and 2 months of lodging paid in gold, and who spent the winter feast with Lady Cassiel's hand on his wrist." Aldrich's face had gone the color of the ash in the fireplace. "And the treasury," she continued, keeping her voice even, because this was not satisfaction, and she could not allow herself to treat it as satisfaction, "has been losing money through Brennick's grain contracts at a rate that compounds annually. I have compared 3 years of shipping manifests against official records. The discrepancy is not subtle. It is the discrepancy of men who stopped worrying about being caught." The room was very quiet. "Why?" Aldrich said, and his voice had something in it she hadn't heard before, not anger, not denial. Something that sounded closer to the specific exhaustion of a man who had been choosing the wrong thing for a long time and had just reached the place where he could feel the full weight of that choice. "Why didn't you come to me with this?" She looked at him. "I came to you in the 2nd year," she said, "with discrepancies in the quarterly supply accounts. You told me I had misread the accounting system. I came to you in the 4th year, with a letter I intercepted that outlined a plan to redirect border tax revenue through a private merchant house. You told me the letter was likely fabricated by someone with a grievance." His jaw was tight. "I stopped coming to you," she said, "when I understood that the information wasn't the problem. You heard me every time. The problem was that acting on the information cost more than you were willing to pay." He stood up, crossed to the window, stood with his back to her looking out at the north wall, and she could see in the set of his shoulders the exact shape of a man who had arrived at something he could no longer manage by not arriving at it. "Drever," he said to the window, "has been running this for at least 5 years," she said. "Ferric is the operational piece. Drever is the architect. Brennick is one of at minimum 6 lords who are taking cuts from redirected revenue. The iron stockpile is the part I don't have full documentation on yet, but the quantity and the lack of records tells me it isn't defensive repositioning. He turned. His face was hard now in a way she hadn't seen before. Not the hardness of a man about to do something decisive, but the hardness of a man who had just understood how badly he had let something go. "I need that documentation," he said. "I know." "Where is it?" She looked at him. This was the point. This was the exact point she had been moving toward and away from all morning, the place where the calculation crystallized into a single choice. She had prepared for this question. She had prepared 3 possible answers and the conditions under which she would use each one. The problem was that the condition she was in was not one of the 3 she had planned for. Drever had moved her to this tower. Drever had access to the king's ear. Drever had already found one thread of her network and pulled it. And the man sitting across from her, who had allowed 7 years of public humiliation, who had heard evidence and chosen convenience, who had last night stood in front of his fire and said the word arrangements like it meant nothing. This man was also the only institutional authority in Thornvale that currently outranked Colum Drever. She needed him. That was a bitter thing to understand, but she had learned a long time ago that survival did not ask permission to be complicated. "It's safe," she said, "and it will stay safe as long as we move carefully." "I'm the king," he said. "Tell me where it is." "And I am your queen," she said, her voice still entirely even, "who you just had escorted to a tower room at the request of the man we are currently discussing. Forgive me if I need something from you first." He stared at her. She held it. The fire was low and the morning was cold and the room smelled of old stone, and in the silence between them something shifted. The specific shift that happens when a person looks at another person and realizes they have been fundamentally wrong about the nature of that person for a very long time. "What do you need?" he said. "Drever removed from his post by the end of today," she said. "Publicly. On your authority. On record with the Crown Council. If I do that, he'll move. Yes, which is why it has to happen by the end of today, before he has time to respond to losing the position." She leaned forward slightly. "I know you don't want to do it. I know what it costs you. But I need you to understand that what he is building with Farrick and Brennick and Torvin Alde is not a secondary operation you can manage around. It is a direct threat to your crown, to your life. And I have the evidence that proves it, but I cannot deliver that evidence to you from inside this room." The silence stretched. Aldrich looked at his hands. She watched him think, watched the specific work of a man dismantling a comfortable fiction he had been living inside for years and trying to locate the floor underneath it. "By the end of today," he said finally. "Yes?" He stood, moved to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame and turned back. "The documentation," he said. "You'll bring it to me." "When Drever is out of the palace," she said, "and when I am out of this room." "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. She did not look away. Then he left. Whooped. She heard his footsteps on the stairs, heard the guard's voice below, a question, and Aldrich's voice answering in a register that had more command in it than she had heard from him in years. Not enough. Possibly not enough. But something. She turned back to the room. The fire had gone nearly out. The window showed a sky that was the flat gray of a day that had not decided what it was doing yet. She pressed 2 fingers against her palm. The next hours would determine everything. If Aldrich moved on Drever today, Drever would have somewhere between 2 and 6 hours to respond before his access to palace resources was cut. A man who had been running a coordinated operation for 5 years did not build that operation without contingencies. He would have a move prepared for exactly this scenario, which meant the moment Aldrich walked out of Drever's dismissal meeting, every person Serafina had ever cultivated, every thread she had built over 7 years would be in motion. And Dessa was out there with the ledger, moving toward Petrosolin's cloth shop, and Councillor Vane was either still in place or already compromised, and the centennial celebration was 4 months away, and the iron stockpile was sitting somewhere between the capital and the border without a paper trail. The bolt on the outside of the door slid back. The guard opened it. "His Majesty says you're free to return to your chambers, Your Majesty." She stood, smoothed her dress, touched the knot of her hair once to check it was still in place. She walked out of the North Tower room and into the corridor without looking back. And by the time she reached the main palace, she could hear it. The particular quality of noise that moves through a building when something official and irreversible has just happened. Voices pitched slightly too high, footsteps moving slightly too fast. The sound of a court that had just felt the ground shift beneath it. She turned the corner toward the east wing. Drever was standing in the center of the corridor, not fleeing, not panicked, standing with his lamp in his hand, his cedar oil smell preceding him in the cold air, his rings catching the light from the wall sconces. Two of his private guards flanked him, and his expression was exactly what she had expected it to be. Not surprised, not angry. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something that has stopped being a manageable problem and started being the reason he has to accelerate his timeline. "Your Majesty," he said. "Colum?" she said. 3 seconds of silence. "Whatever the king has told you," he said, his voice at its usual controlled register, "I want you to know that there are things in motion that are larger than any single conversation happening today inside this palace. Things that will continue regardless of who holds what position." She held his gaze. "I know," she said. His eyes narrowed fractionally. The first genuine tell she had ever seen from him. "Then you understand," he said, "that the prudent choice—" "The iron," she said, and watched it land. Watched the specific quality of stillness that came over him. "You moved it last night. Or you started to. East Road, unregistered carriage. Where's it going, Colum?" The corridor was very quiet. Drever looked at her for a long moment. Then very softly, he said, "You should not have found that." "And yet," she said. His hand tightened once on the lamp. A small motion. She clocked it. "Whatever documentation you believe you have," he said, "I would think very carefully about who you trust to protect it. Networks have gaps. People have prices." A pause that was constructed rather than natural, the pause of a man delivering a line he had prepared. "Even loyal handmaids." The bottom dropped out of something inside her, smooth and cold and instantaneous. Dessa. She kept her face completely still, did not blink, did not breathe differently, let nothing reach the surface. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. She walked past him. She kept walking, her pace unhurried, her footsteps even on the stone, until she turned the corner and was out of his sight line. Then she moved. She moved the way she had learned to move in the 4th year of her marriage, when she first understood that the palace was not a home, but a terrain. A mapped space where visibility was a variable you managed, not a condition you accepted. Fast enough to cover ground, controlled enough to not register as running. The east corridor to the servants' passage, the passage to the kitchen wing to the rear stairs that came up behind the linen storage adjacent to her chambers. She was counting seconds in her head, not obsessively, not the way fear counts, but the way a woman who has spent 7 years treating time as a tactical resource counts. Because Drever's statement about loyal handmaids was either a bluff or it wasn't, and if it wasn't, Dessa had between 40 minutes and 2 hours before someone came for her, depending on when Drever had made his move and how many people he had positioned. She hit the rear stairs and took them 2 at a time. The linen storage door was unlocked. She pushed through it, moved through the narrow gap between stacked shelves, came out into the side corridor that ran parallel to her chambers. The door to her rooms was open. Not fully open. 6 inches. Enough. She stopped. Stood in the corridor for 3 full seconds and listened. The palace's ambient noise, distant voices, the sound of something being moved in a room below, a door somewhere in the west wing, all of it present and calibrated in her awareness. She filtered through it, nothing from inside her chambers. She pushed the door open and went in. The room had been searched, not ransacked. This was not the kind of search that announces itself. This was the kind that tries to leave no evidence it happened. The books on her writing desk had been shifted 2 inches to the left. The second drawer of her bureau was not fully closed. The small cedar chest at the foot of her bed had been opened and relatched, but the latch was not seated flush the way she always left it. She stood in the center of the room and looked at all of it without touching anything. The blue ledger was gone. She had sent it with Dessa the previous night. That was correct. That was the plan working. But Drever knew about the ledger specifically. She was certain of that now, Because a man who simply suspected a queen of gathering intelligence did not make a specific reference to protecting documentation. He had said whatever documentation you believe you have. He knew what he was looking for, which meant the question was not whether the search had found the ledger. It hadn't. Dessa had it. The question was whether Dessa still had it, and whether Dessa was still free, and whether the thread Drever had pulled on her network had led him to Petra Solin's cloth shop before or after Dessa arrived there. She moved to the writing desk, opened the third drawer, her actual working drawer, the one she kept visible and organized precisely because visible and organized spaces read as spaces with nothing to hide. Beneath the correspondence stack, under 3 separate documents, she found what she was looking for: a small folded square of cloth, off-white, with 2 horizontal stitches near the left edge. Dessa had been here since the search. The cloth was a signal they had established in the first year of working together, used exactly once before, a confirmation of safe passage. 2 stitches meant, I was here, I am not followed, I continue forward. The relief was physical, a single breath, deep and controlled, before she locked it down. Dessa was still moving. The ledger was still in play. She had to get to Petra Solin's before Drever did. The market district was 40 minutes from the palace on foot through the back streets. She did not take the main roads, and she did not take a carriage. She wore a plain wool cloak she kept for precisely this kind of movement. Nothing that identified rank, nothing decorative, the kind of garment that belonged on 40 different women she might pass in the street. She walked. The cold had settled into the capital overnight, and the morning streets had the particular quality of a city still clearing its head. Merchants setting up stalls, cartwheels on cobblestones, the smell of bread from a bakehouse on the first intersection. She moved through it without stopping, keeping her pace consistent, registering every person who came within 20 feet of her without letting her gaze linger. She was not afraid. That was the strange thing, the thing she had noticed about herself over the years. That when the threat was real and immediate and had a specific shape, the fear that had existed in the theoretical space before it arrived tended to go quiet. Not absent. Present, but compressed. Working for her rather than against her, sharpening the edges of what she was looking at rather than blurring them. Drever's voice in the corridor. Even loyal handmaids. He had set it to rattle her, to insert doubt between herself and the one person in the palace she trusted without reservation. It was the move of a man who understood that a woman's network was only as strong as her confidence in the people holding it, and that a single planted doubt could fracture a structure that no external force had managed to break. She understood what he was doing. She was still doing the arithmetic of whether it was true. Dessa had been with her for 6 years. She had been recruited not through gratitude or ideology, but through a specific transaction. Serafina had discovered, in her 2nd year at court, that Dessa's younger brother had been falsely imprisoned on a debt accusation staged by a lord who wanted the family's land. Serafina had not freed him as a favor. She had freed him as a demonstration of what she could do, of how she operated, of what working for her actually meant, versus what working for the court's random cruelty meant. Dessa had understood the offer precisely. She had accepted it with clear eyes. 6 years. Not one leak. Not one misdirection. Not one morning when the wrong person seemed to know something that should have stayed quiet. But Drever had been running this operation for 5 years, and patience was not exclusively Serafina's characteristic. She turned onto Callan Street. Petra Solin's cloth shop was the 3rd building on the left, distinguishable from its neighbors by a blue awning that had faded to the color of a winter sky and a window display that was functional rather than decorative. Inside, through the glass, Serafina could see bolts of fabric arranged by color along the walls and a long wooden counter at the back. The door was unlocked. A small bell sounded when she pushed it open. Petra was behind the counter. A solid woman in her 50s with gray threaded through her dark hair and the kind of hands that showed decades of physical work. She looked up when Serafina entered, and her expression did something complicated in the space of a half-second. Recognition, followed immediately by something that was not relief. "I need blue cloth," Serafina said. Petra's jaw set. That was the answer. Not the words, the jaw. "Sit down," Petra said. Her voice was very quiet. Where is she? Serafina said. Sit down, Your Majesty, please. The please was what did it. The specific weight of it, the way it landed in the room like something set down carefully because it might break. Serafina sat in the chair beside the counter and looked at Petra Solin's face and understood that the arithmetic she had been running for 40 minutes had just resolved in the worst direction. Tell me, she said. She came an hour before dawn, Petra said, with the ledger. I took it, I put it where we'd agreed, and she left. Petra's hands were flat on the counter. 20 minutes later, 2 men came in, not guards, no uniforms, but the way they moved, the way they stood in the shop. She stopped. They knew what they were looking for. They found the space behind the panel in 20 minutes. The space behind the panel had taken Serafina 3 months to plan and commission through a carpenter who had no connection to the court. They took the ledger, Serafina said. Yes. The words sat in the room, 7 years. Every notation, every name, every cross-referenced discrepancy, an intercepted letter and dated transaction. Encoded in cipher, yes, but Drever had 5 years of operational infrastructure and access to resources that included people who broke ciphers for a living. She looked at the grain of the wooden counter. The thing about losing something you have spent years building is that the loss does not hit all at once. It arrives in pieces, each piece a different calculation of what the lost thing was worth and what its absence now meant. The first piece was the evidence itself, gone. The second piece was the network location it had been taken from, compromised, meaning Petra Solin's was burned. The third piece was the question of how they had found the space behind the panel, which had only 3 possible answers: the carpenter, Dessa, or a level of surveillance on Petra's shop that had preceded Dessa's arrival and meant Drever had mapped more of the network than she had believed. Did they say anything? She said. The men who came. One of them. Petra's voice was careful. He said to tell you, if you came, that the property belonged to its rightful owners now. Property. Not documentation, not ledger. Property. It was a message constructed by someone who wanted her to understand the full scope of what had just shifted. The iron, the treasury funds, the redirected revenue. Drever was not framing his operation as corruption. He was framing it as redistribution, rightful ownership. The ideological architecture of a man who had spent 5 years telling himself a story about what he was doing and had started to believe it. Are you safe here? Serafina asked. Petra looked at her. Probably not. Then close the shop today. Go to your sister in the mill district. Don't come back for 2 weeks. And the arrangement is suspended, she said. She stood. I'm sorry, Petra, for what this has cost you. Petra nodded once, the nod of a woman who had understood the risk when she entered it and was not looking for an apology now. Serafina left. She was 2 streets from the shop when she found Dessa, not the way she expected to find her. Dessa was sitting on the low stone wall outside a closed cooperage, her hands in her lap, her face showing the specific quality of a person who has been through something recent and is now on the far side of it, and not yet sure what the far side means. There was a small cut above her left eyebrow that had been bleeding and had stopped. Serafina crossed the street and sat beside her on the wall. She did not speak immediately. Let the silence be what it was. They didn't follow me, Dessa said. Her voice was flat. I was certain of that. I ran the counter route twice. I doubled back at the mill crossing. Nobody was behind me. I know, Serafina said. They were already there. Dessa turned to look at her. Her eyes were red but dry now. They were at the shop before I arrived. The panel. How did they know about the panel? The carpenter, Serafina said. It was the answer that was left once she eliminated the other 2. Drever got to the carpenter at some point, possibly months ago. He's been waiting for us to use it. Dessa absorbed this. The cut above her eyebrow had left a thin, dry line of rust across her skin. He planned for this specifically, Dessa said. He planned for the possibility of it. There's a difference, but not one that helps us right now. A cart rolled past on the street, a child's voice somewhere to the left. The ordinary texture of a city morning continuing to operate while the thing they had built for 7 years sat in a box somewhere in Drever's network. The cipher, Dessa said. Can he break it? Given enough time and the right people, Serafina looked at the cobblestones. 6 weeks, maybe 8. And the centennial is in 4 months. Yes. Dessa was quiet for a moment. So we still have a window. We have a window, Serafina said. We don't have documentation anymore. She felt Dessa go very still beside her, because they both understood what that meant. The documentation had been the spine of everything, the mechanism by which a public revelation could not be denied or reframed. Without it, any accusation Serafina made in a public setting could be dismissed as the maneuvering of a foreign queen with a personal grievance. It could be framed, skillfully, as exactly the kind of political aggression that justified Drever's concern about her in the first place. He had not just taken the evidence, he had taken her credibility. She pressed 2 fingers against her palm, held the pressure. She thought about what remained. The people she had cultivated were partially burned, but not entirely. Counselor Vane was still in place. She had received no indication that Drever had reached him yet, and Vane operated at a level of institutional remove that made him harder to access than a market district cloth merchant. General Harwick himself was still the kingdom's senior military command. It was only his aide who had disappeared, not the general. And there were 3 provincial governors she had been building relationships with over the past 2 years, slowly, through legitimate diplomatic correspondence, the kind of communication that was too public to suppress without creating its own questions. She could rebuild a partial case, not in documents, in people, in testimony. But testimony required witnesses willing to stand in a public forum and speak, and witnesses willing to stand in a public forum and speak required a level of institutional protection that right now she did not have, because the man she had sent the king to dismiss that morning had just demonstrated that his reach extended to spaces she had believed were secure, which meant Drever was not dismissed. She stood up. "Come with me," she said to Dessa. "Not to the palace." "Where?" "Counselor Vane's residence." She started moving. "We go now, before Drever finishes whatever he's doing and turns his full attention back to the capital." Dessa fell into step beside her without hesitation. That was the thing about Dessa. She was not a person who needed the full picture before she moved. She needed enough of it, and she had always known when she had enough. They were 4 streets from Vane's residence when Serafina heard the bells. Not the hour bell, not the assembly bell, the crisis bell. The one hung in the palace's central tower, the one that had its own specific pattern, 3 short rings and 1 long, that existed for exactly one purpose in the history of Thornvale. It had rung twice in the past 100 years, once during an attempted siege and once during a fire in the East Wing. It was ringing now. She stopped in the middle of the street. People around her were stopping too. Merchants, walkers, a woman with a basket of bread. All of them turning their faces toward the palace on instinct, the way people turn toward the source of a sound that their body recognizes as significant before their mind catches up. 3 short, 1 long, 3 short, 1 long. "What is that?" Dessa said, her voice stripped of everything except the question. Serafina already knew. The knowing had arrived before she could stop it, assembled from the variables she had been managing all morning. Drever still in the palace, Drever not fled, Drever speaking to her in a corridor with the tone of a man inside a plan that was already executing. The crisis bell was not rung for fires or sieges anymore. It was rung when a specific institutional emergency required immediate assembly of the Crown Council. It was rung specifically when the legitimacy of the monarch was in question. "Aldrich," she said. Not a question. A calculation completing itself. She turned, started moving back toward the palace, faster now. "Serafina," Dessa was keeping pace beside her. "If Drever is the one who rang it, he isn't ringing it," she said. "He convinced someone else to ring it. That's how he works. Clean hands, maximum damage. 3 short, 1 long, still going." The streets were beginning to fill with people moving toward the palace. The sound of the crisis bell had its own gravity. It pulled the city toward its source. She moved through the crowd in the opposite direction of its instinct, cutting toward the east gate rather than the main entrance, toward the servants' passage she had used an hour ago, because the main entrance right now was exactly where Drever would be expecting anyone who wanted to know what was happening to arrive. and she had no intention of arriving where she was expected. She needed to see the council chamber before the session opened. She needed to find Aldrich. She needed to understand what Drever had just done, because the crisis bell meant he had stopped being careful. And a man who stops being careful is a man who has decided he no longer needs to be. And the reason a man in Drever's position decides he no longer needs to be careful is the reason that had been sitting in the back of her calculations all morning, the one she had refused to weight too heavily because the alternative it implied was worse than anything she had prepared for. He wasn't running. He hadn't moved the iron to flee. He hadn't dismissed her to the tower to buy time to escape. He had been positioning himself this entire time not to leave the kingdom, but to take it. The Crown Council chambers could strip a king of authority. Drever had spent 5 years building the votes to do exactly that. She hit the east gate at a near run. Dessa a half step behind her, the bells still ringing over the rooftops, the city still pulling toward it, and somewhere inside the palace, her husband was either already in front of the council or already too late. And the 7 years of documentation that would have made this moment survivable was sitting in a box in Drever's hands, its cipher already being worked by someone who knew what they were looking for. She had nothing. She had a husband who had spent 7 years choosing convenience and might finally be choosing differently. She had a partial network, half burned, the rest untested under this kind of pressure. She had Dessa. She had herself. And she had exactly the thing Drever had spent 5 years dismissing, the thing every man in that court had spent 7 years mistaking for weakness, the thing she had been quietly feeding and building in the space created by their contempt. The patient, absolute, comprehensive knowledge of every single one of them. She went through the East Gate. Whatever she had been before, the diplomat's daughter, the foreign queen, the woman who endured because endurance was what the situation required. That version of her had operated inside rules she hadn't written and constraints she hadn't chosen. The bell was still ringing when she understood, with the cold clarity of a woman who has just lost everything she built and found something harder underneath it, that she was done operating inside anyone else's rules. The plan from here would not look like anything she had done before. It would not be careful. It would not be patient. It would be the thing she had been holding back for 7 years, the part of herself she had kept controlled and documented and measured, released now into a situation where measured was no longer the right tool. She crossed the courtyard toward the palace doors. Behind her, the bell rang on. She hit the servants' passage at a run and came out inside the kitchen wing, moving fast enough that the 2 cooks' assistants near the door flattened themselves against the wall without being asked. The palace had a sound now, not the bell. The bell had stopped 3 minutes ago, which meant the council had already begun assembling, which meant the window between the bell and a formal session opening was closing. That window was traditionally 30 minutes. In a managed process, one where the people running it controlled the timing, it could be compressed to 15. She did not know how long ago the bell had started ringing. She moved through the kitchen corridor, up the rear stairs, left at the landing, through the servants' crossing that ran behind the East Wing's formal rooms. Dessa kept pace without being asked, and the question of where they were going did not need to be said, because there was only one place that mattered right now. The Crown Council chamber was in the central keep, 2nd floor, accessed by a formal staircase from the main hall, or by a narrower administrative corridor that connected to the record rooms. The administrative corridor existed because council sessions generated documentation in real time, secretaries moving between the session room and the archive, the kind of continuous logistical traffic that required a route separate from the formal entrance where guards stood and identities were checked. No guard ever stood in the administrative corridor. No one had ever needed to. She turned into it at the end of the servants' crossing and went through. The corridor smelled of old paper and lamp oil. She could hear voices before she reached the end of it. Not words, the quality of voices, the compressed energy of a room where something institutional and irreversible was being set into motion. She stopped at the archive room door, looked at Dessa. "Stay here," she said. "Serafina, if I don't come out in 20 minutes, go to Vane directly. Tell him everything. Don't wait for me to send word." Dessa's jaw was set. She did not argue. She nodded once. Serafina pushed through the archive room into the secondary door that opened onto the council chamber's side wall. The chamber was already full. 14 council members arranged around the long table, which was the old dark wood that had been in this room since before anyone currently living had been born. The room smelled of candle wax and the specific human warmth of too many bodies in a space designed for formality rather than comfort. At the head of the table sat Lord Chancellor Bered, a man of 60-something with white hair and the expression of a man who had spent 40 years managing institutional process and who could make even a crisis look like a scheduled event. Drever was seated at the right side, 3 chairs from the head. His cedar oil smell was present even here. Aldrich was not at the table. He was standing at the far end of the room, near the window, with the posture of a man who had arrived late to something and was still processing that he was inside it. Every head in the room turned when Serafina came through the side door. She had learned something, over 7 years, about the value of a room going quiet when you enter it. Lesser versions of herself had registered that silence as hostile, as social pressure, as the weight of collective judgment pressing against the walls. The version of herself that had crossed the market district at a run and come through a servant's passage and stood in this room with nothing, no ledger, no documentation, no network intact, understood the silence differently. It was information. It meant they had not expected her here, which meant Drever had not planned for her presence, which meant there was still a gap in his architecture she could move through. She walked to the center of the room. "Lord Chancellor," she said. Her voice was level. "What is the formal basis for this session?" Bered looked at her with the expression of a man weighing procedural options. "Your Majesty, you are not on the council." "I'm aware. I asked the basis for this session." A beat of silence. Around the table, she could feel the council members doing the specific social calculation that happened when 2 sources of institutional authority came into direct contact and the hierarchy between them was suddenly not as clear as everyone had been assuming. Drever spoke from his chair. "The session concerns matters of state security, specifically evidence that has come to the council's attention regarding the activities of certain individuals within the palace operating without the knowledge or sanction of the crown." He said it to the room, not to her. That was a choice. He was treating her as a variable that had entered the equation unexpectedly and needed to be reincorporated without acknowledging the disruption her presence created. She turned to look at him directly, made him the only person she was looking at. "Evidence," she said. "Show me." The room shifted. Drever's expression stayed controlled, but something moved behind it. The micro-adjustment of a man recalculating. "This session is not. You have a document," she said. "You took it this morning from a location in the market district. If that document is the basis for this session, show it to the room." "Your Majesty, show it or declare the basis of this session without it, and let the council determine whether the basis is sufficient." She heard Aldrich move across the room, felt him arrive at her left side without looking. What she had done in the space of 30 seconds was this. She had forced Drever to choose between producing the ledger, which was written in her cipher, which would take time to decode, which meant its actual content was not yet available to be used as evidence, or proceeding with a council session based on claims he could not immediately substantiate in the room. Either choice cost him something. The ledger visible on the table was a document in a foreign cipher that proved nothing until decoded. No ledger was a session without documented evidence, which any competent Lord Chancellor would flag as procedurally insufficient. Bered was already leaning forward slightly, the posture of a man who had noticed the procedural question. "The gentleman raises matters that require evidentiary foundation," Bered said, with the careful neutrality of an institutional man threading a needle. "If evidence is claimed, it should be presented." Drever looked at Bered. His expression had gone very still. "The evidence is currently being processed," he said. "Its content is sufficient to—" "Being processed," Serafina said, "means it is not yet in a form this council can evaluate. Lord Chancellor, a session convened on unverifiable evidence is not a session. It's a performance." The word landed. She watched it move around the table, watched 3 council members who had been sitting with the careful blankness of men who had been told this was a formality shift into something more attentive. Watched Lord Vane, Councillor Vane, seated at the table's far left, a thin man with careful eyes who had brought her 3 pages of copied documents 16 months ago. look at her with an expression she could not fully read, but which contained, underneath its caution, something that looked like recognition. Drever stood. He had been seated through all of this, which was the posture of a man who believed the room was already his. Standing was an escalation. It was the first tell she had seen him give in a room that was watching. "What is being performed," he said, his voice finally showing its edge, "is an attempt by an individual who has been running an unauthorized intelligence operation within this palace for years to disrupt a legitimate security proceeding. Unauthorized." She let the word sit. "By whose authority is intelligence within the Crown Palace authorized or unauthorized?" "The King's." "Then ask him." Every head in the room turned to Aldrich. She had not planned this moment. She had not had time to plan it. What she had done was work the room's procedural logic and the variable of Drever's incomplete evidence until she arrived at a point where the King's voice was the thing the room needed, and the King was standing at her left side. This was the exact moment 7 years of patience had been building toward. Not a document, not a confession, a room full of institutional authority, a procedural gap, and a king who had been asked a direct question in front of witnesses. She did not look at Aldrich. She kept her eyes on Drever and let Aldrich choose. The silence in the chamber had the quality of a held breath. 14 council members, a Lord Chancellor, a queen with nothing in her hands but 7 years of knowledge, and a man who had spent those years choosing comfort over cost. Aldrich said, "The Queen's activities within the palace were known to me." The room did not erupt. It didn't need to. The shift was quieter than that. The specific quality of air changing in a space when something that was one thing becomes something else. Drever's face went through 3 changes in 2 seconds. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice stripped down to its operational core. "The evidence we have recovered clearly demonstrates was not authorized by you," Aldrich said. "You recovered documents from a private citizen's property without a crown warrant. The security situation required a warrant," Aldrich said again, "which you did not have, Lord Chancellor." Barrett was already sitting straighter. "Yes, Your Majesty. I want to know the legal standing of evidence recovered without crown authorization from a private residence." Barrett's answer was immediate, the reflex of a man who had spent 40 years knowing exactly where the procedural lines were. "Evidence recovered without warrant is inadmissible in any formal council proceeding and constitutes a violation of Crown property statutes, Your Majesty. The individuals who conducted such a recovery would be subject to formal inquiry." The room was very quiet. Drever looked at Aldrich for a long moment. She watched it happen, watched the calculation behind his eyes, the rapid reassessment of a man whose plan had depended on the King's continued passivity and had just discovered that passivity had a limit. "This isn't finished," Drever said. Not to the room. To her. Directly, finally, the pretense of addressing the council dropped completely. "You have no documentation. You have no network. What you have is a king who made a statement under pressure in a public room, and that statement can be recontextualized." She looked at him. "You're right," she said. "I have no documentation." She let that sit for exactly 1 second. "But I have 7 years of memory, and unlike a document, you cannot put memory in a box and carry it out of a market district shop." She turned to the Lord Chancellor. "I would like to make a formal deposition to this council. Not today. In 3 weeks at a date of your choosing, with full procedural protocol. I will speak from memory to everything I have documented over the past 7 years regarding the financial and operational activities of Lord Drever, Lord Farrick Thornvale, Lord Brennick, and 6 additional members of this court." She paused. "Any council member who wishes to verify what I say against independent records is welcome to do so. I will name sources. I will provide dates. I will describe specifics that can be cross-referenced against shipping manifests, treasury records, and the testimony of individuals currently outside the capital who are willing to speak." The room was absolutely still. Drever had gone the color of old ash, because a document in cipher could be held. A document in cipher could be decoded slowly, reframed, dismissed as fabricated. A deposition given from memory in formal session, with dates and names and cross-referenceable specifics, in front of 14 council members and a Lord Chancellor, on record. That was a different animal entirely. That was a proceeding with its own institutional momentum, one that would be entered into the permanent record of the Crown Council and could not be quietly made to disappear. And the sources she had named, individuals currently outside the capital, told him, if he was listening carefully, that not all of her network was burned, that Petra Solins was not the whole of it, that she had held things back. She had. She had always held things back. Lord Chancellor, Drever said, his voice finally showing strain. I object to— Noted, Bered said, with the precise finality of a man who had just made a decision about which direction the institutional wind was blowing. The Queen's request for formal deposition session is accepted. I will set the date within the week. Drever looked at Bered, then he looked at Aldrich, then he looked at her. She held his gaze and did not look away, and did not speak, and did not offer him anything at all. No mercy, no acknowledgement, no space in which a negotiation could be imagined to begin. 7 years of documented silence, offered now as its own kind of answer. He walked out of the council chamber. Not fled. Walked. With the controlled movement of a man preserving what he still had, calculating on the move, the kind of exit that was itself a message. This is not over. She knew it wasn't. The council session dissolved without formal conclusion, which was itself a conclusion of a kind. Council members moved toward the exits in clusters of 2 and 3, their voices low, their expressions doing the specific work of people recalibrating what they knew and didn't know about the structure they operated inside. Vane caught her eye as he passed. He did not speak. He touched 2 fingers briefly to his jacket pocket, the location of a sealed document, or the suggestion of one. She held his gaze for 1 second and moved on. Aldrich found her in the corridor outside. He looked like a man who had just put his hand into a fire and was still in the moment of registering the heat rather than the damage. Drever will move tonight, he said. Whatever he's been building, he'll move it. Yes, she said. The iron. We need to know where it is, not the way station. That was a transfer point. It's been moved since last night. Where does Farrick have property within 2 days' ride of the capital? Aldrich thought. A hunting estate in the Pelham Valley, and a mill that stopped operating 2 years ago near the Oster River crossing. The mill, she said immediately. Inactive mill, river access, 2 days from the capital. It was the kind of location chosen specifically because its former purpose explained the infrastructure, so loading docks, storage, heavy equipment housing, without requiring new construction that would appear in any record. I need General Harwick, she said, not his aide, Harwick himself. I can send— Don't send anyone Drever knows, no palace messenger. Do you have someone outside the official staff? Someone who has never had any connection to Drever's household? Aldrich was quiet for a moment, then, my old cavalry commander, retired 8 years ago, lives near the North Market. He's never been part of the court. Send him. Tonight, before the second bell. Harwick needs to know about the Oster Mill, and he needs men moving before dawn. Aldrich nodded. His jaw was set in a way she had not seen on him before. Not the hard set of a man suppressing discomfort, but the harder set of a man who had decided to stop suppressing it. Serafina. He stopped. The corridor was empty around them, but his voice dropped anyway. What I said in the council room. I should have said it years ago. She looked at him. Yes, she said. You should have. She did not give him absolution, and he did not ask for it, and the silence between them was the honest kind. Not comfortable, not hostile, just real in the way that things are real when they have finally been set at their actual weight. Send your cavalry commander, she said. Tonight. She turned and walked back toward the east wing. Dessa was still in the archive room. The expression on her face when Serafina came through the door was the expression of someone who had spent 20 minutes in a small room with nothing but their own thoughts and the sound of muffled institutional crisis through a wall. Vane, Serafina said, is he clean? As far as I can determine, Dessa said, Drever's reach into the council is through Farrick's connections, not his own. Vane has always been trade commission, different network. I need you to go to him tonight. Not through any existing contact point. Those are all burned, directly. His home residence, after dark. You will tell him that the deposition session I requested from the Lord Chancellor will require his testimony as a council member who has personally observed irregularities in Treasury documentation. He already knows what he saw. He needs to know he won't be standing alone. Dessa absorbed this. And if Drever already has people watching his residence, then we find that out tonight rather than 3 weeks from now, and we adjust. She met Dessa's eyes. I know what I'm asking. I know you do, Dessa said. That's not what I'm measuring. The cut above her eyebrow had dried fully now, a thin line of rust brown against her skin. Go home first, Serafina said. Eat something, 2 hours. And you? I'll be in my chambers. Drever will have someone watching the door. He always does, and now he has reason to move that person closer. I need him to believe I'm contained tonight, sitting with what happened, recovering. Dessa looked at her for a moment with the expression of a woman who had spent 6 years learning the difference between what Serafina said and what Serafina was doing. You're not recovering, she said. No, Serafina said. I'm not. She was in her chambers by the 4th bell, the door closed, the lamp lit at the writing desk, the room arranged to look exactly like a woman sitting quietly with the aftermath of a difficult day. She had changed her dress. The plain wool cloak hung by the door, replaced with something that read as domestic, the visual language of a person who had come home and intended to stay there. For an hour she sat and did not write anything and did not move anything and worked entirely in her mind. She rebuilt the evidentiary structure from memory. Not 7 years of it. She did not need 7 years. She needed the specific 18 months that were most current, most verifiable, most cross-referenceable against records that existed in multiple locations simultaneously and therefore could not be made to disappear by seizing any single document. The grain contracts were in the merchant family's own records. The shipping manifests were copied in the Port Authority archives at 3 separate coastal waypoints. The Treasury discrepancies Vane had found were in his own documentation, never shared with Drever's network. The cipher in the blue ledger would take Drever's people 6 to 8 weeks to break. When they broke it, they would find what she had encoded. What she had encoded was thorough and damning and was also, she understood now with the cold clarity of a woman who had just spent a morning losing and regaining and losing again. Not the only version of this story that could be told. A deposition from memory, given before the full council in formal session, with Vane's corroborating testimony and 3 provincial governors who had been receiving her correspondence for 2 years, that was not a document that could be carried out of a shop. She was so deep in the calculation that she almost missed it. The smell, cedar oil. She turned her head toward the window. It was closed. She had closed it herself when she came in. The smell was not coming from outside. It was already in the room. She stood up from the desk in the same motion she turned. One fluid motion, the kind that comes from a body that has been waiting at a lower level of alertness than the mind and has just received information the mind hadn't processed yet. Drever was not in the room. The room was empty, but the cedar oil smell was there, faint but specific, the kind left by a person who had been present recently, within the hour. While she was in the council chamber, while she was in the corridor with Aldrich, while Dessa was in the archive room. Someone had been in here. She looked at the writing desk. The lamp was exactly where she had placed it. The correspondence stack was exactly as she had left it. The 3rd drawer, the one where she kept visible and organized documents precisely because visible and organized read as nothing to hide, was closed. She crossed to it, opened it, looked at the correspondence stack. The small folded square of cloth that Dessa had left, the signal, 2 stitches, safe passage confirmed, was gone. In its place was a single piece of paper, folded once. She unfolded it. 4 words. In a handwriting she recognized from 7 years of council session, minutes and official correspondence, and the specific compact penmanship of a man who had spent decades managing other people's information. Tomorrow. The centennial moves. She read it twice. The centennial celebration was 4 months away. Drever was accelerating the timeline. Whatever he had been building toward, the Iron, Ferric, Torvin Alda, the Crown Council session he had tried to convene this morning, he was not waiting for the centennial. He was moving it, which meant the iron at the Oster mill was not in storage. It was in position, which meant Harwick's men moving before dawn was not early enough. She turned, crossed to the door, opened it. The guard in the corridor was not the palace household guard she recognized. He was one of Drever's private retinue, standing at her door at the 7th bell of the evening with the specific posture of a man who had been placed rather than assigned. She looked at him. He looked at her. She understood, with the complete and instantaneous clarity of a woman who had just run out of the version of this situation that had options, that Drever was not watching her anymore. He was containing her. The note was not a threat, it was a declaration. He had put it in her room to let her know that she knew, and that knowing changed nothing, because by the time the council session she had requested in 3 weeks arrived, there would be no council to receive her deposition. There would be a different set of men in those chairs. There would be a different crown on a different head. She looked at the guard for exactly 3 more seconds. Then she said very quietly, "I need to send a message to General Harwick." The guard said nothing. "I understand you have instructions," she said. "I am asking you to carry one message, 4 words, to the general personally." Still nothing. She looked at him with the full weight of everything she was. 7 years of patience and calculation, and the specific quality of a woman who has been underestimated so completely and for so long that the underestimation has become the only weapon she has left. "The mill at Oster," she said. "Tonight." The guard's eyes shifted fractionally, just enough. She waited. The guard looked at her for 7 seconds. She counted them. Then he turned and walked to the end of the corridor, where a younger palace attendant was stationed near the stairwell. She watched him speak low and fast, watched the attendant's face process the instruction and resolve into movement, watched the attendant take the stairs at a pace that was not casual. She went back into her chambers and closed the door. She did not know if the message would reach Harwick. She did not know if Harwick still had the operational freedom to move men before dawn, or whether Drever's network had already worked into the military command structure in ways she hadn't mapped. What she knew was that she had done the thing available to her in the situation she was in, and that from this point forward the night would go the way it went. She sat at the writing desk and began to work from memory. Not a document, not a cipher. A letter, written in plain language, addressed to Lord Chancellor Bered, containing specific dates and names and transaction amounts that she did not need a ledger to recall, because she had spent 7 years putting them into her memory the way a stonemason puts mortar between bricks. Not for a single wall, but for a structure that would hold under pressure. She wrote for 2 hours. She wrote until the lamp began to gutter, and she trimmed it without looking up and kept writing. When she finished, she folded the letter, sealed it with plain wax. No crest, nothing identifiable, and sat with it in her hands. If Harwick moved on the mill tonight and found the iron and found Ferric Thornvale's operational infrastructure, the letter in her hands became corroboration rather than primary evidence. If Harwick didn't move or couldn't or arrived too late, the letter was the only documentation she had left, and it was written in her own hand and bore her own testimony and would stand or fall on whether 14 council members decided a foreign queen's word was sufficient. She had been here before. Not in this specific room with this specific letter, but in this specific place. The place where the preparation was complete and the outcome was not yet determined, and there was nothing left to do but wait for the morning to show her which version of the future had arrived. She was not afraid. She was tired, in the bone-deep way of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just set it down, even if only temporarily, even if only because the hands needed a moment before picking it back up. The knock came at the 5th bell of morning. Not Drever's guards. The knock had a different quality. The specific pattern Dessa had used for 6 years, 2 quick and 1 slower. The kind of code that was too simple to be suspicious and too consistent to be accidental. Serafina was already awake. She had slept 2 hours in the chair, the letter on the desk beside her, and woken when the palace's ambient sound changed in the way it changes before dawn when the kitchen fires start and the first staff begin moving through the lower corridors. She opened the door. Dessa came in fast. Her cloak was damp from outside air, and her face had the particular intensity of a person carrying news that is both better and worse than expected. "Harwick moved," she said. Serafina held very still. "And?" The mill at Oster. He sent 40 cavalry before midnight. Dessa's jaw was tight. They found the iron, enough to arm 600 men, and they found Farrick Thornvale in the mill's upper room with Torvin Alde and two of Alde's associates. Farrick, physically present at the location. Not an inference, not a paper connection. Farrick Thornvale caught in an operational site by the Kingdom's senior military command. Drever, she said. Not at the mill, but Harwick's men detained everyone present, and Farrick broke within the first hour. Dessa met her eyes. He gave Drever's full name, on record, in front of Harwick's officers and two of Harwick's adjutants who have been with him for 15 years. The room was very quiet for a moment. Serafina sat down on the edge of the bed, not because her legs failed, just because the information required her to stop moving and actually feel the weight of what had just been handed to her after a night of not knowing whether it would come. Is Vane safe? She asked. He was when I left him. He's already drafting his formal testimony for the council session. Dessa paused. He said to tell you. He said he should have moved sooner, that he'd been waiting for someone to move first. She absorbed that, the specific loneliness of it. A man with evidence who waited because he needed to see someone else act before he could trust that acting was survivable. She understood it. She could not afford to be angry at it. Too many people in this kingdom had made that same calculation for too many years, and the question now was not the waiting, but what they did with the window that had opened. Drever, she said again. Where is he? Still in the palace, Dessa said. Or was as of 2 hours ago. His private guards are still posted. He hasn't fled. She looked at Dessa. He's waiting to see if Farrick holds, she said. Farrick already broke. Drever doesn't know that yet. She stood, smoothed her dress, the same dress she had put on the night before. She had not changed. There had not been time. She picked up the letter from the desk. Go to Lord Chancellor Barrett, she said. Now, before the morning session begins. Give him this. She handed Dessa the letter. And tell him General Harwick will be at the palace by the 8th bell with formal documentation of what was found at the Oster Mill and the formal statement of Farrick Thornvale. Dessa took the letter. Serafina. She stopped at the door. When this is done, when today is done, Serafina said. Sleep. She found Drever in the east corridor at the 7th bell, not because she had planned to find him there, because the palace had a logic to it, a physical grammar, and when a man like Drever realized the night had not gone the way he had constructed it, when the absence of confirmation from Farrick and the early morning movement of Harwick's cavalry made the shape of the morning visible to him, there was only one direction a man like that moved. Toward information. Toward the specific corridors where information traveled fastest. He was alone. His two private guards were not with him, which told her more than their presence would have. He looked at her, and she could see it in his face. Not the controlled expression of the previous days, but something stripped down to its base. The face of a man who has spent 5 years building something and has just felt it begin to come apart under his feet. Farrick talked, she said. He said nothing. The mill at Oster, she continued. 40 cavalry before midnight. Harwick will be here by the 8th bell. She watched his face. You have perhaps 1 hour before the Lord Chancellor reconvenes the council with evidence you cannot contest. His jaw moved once. You had nothing last night. I had memory, she said, and Harwick, and Vane, and 3 provincial governors who have been corresponding with me for 2 years. She held his gaze. And a king who finally decided that his family's shame was less than his kingdom's survival. The corridor was empty around them. Morning light was coming through the high windows at the far end, the pale flat light of early winter, and it fell across the space between them without warmth. You won't give me a way out of this, he said. Not a question. No, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. She had expected something else. A final move. Another calculated statement. The specific performance of a man who had operated at this level for 5 years and didn't know how to stop performing. Instead, what she saw was simpler than that. The exhaustion of a man who had been inside a lie for so long that he had forgotten what the lie had originally been covering, and who was now standing in a corridor at the 7th bell with nowhere to go and the weight of 5 years of constructed reality about to come down on him. "You're a harder woman than anyone in this court understood," he said. "I know," she said. "That was the point." She walked past him. She did not look back. The council session at the ninth bell was not the session Drever had tried to convene the morning before. General Harwick arrived at the eighth bell with 12 cavalry officers and Farrick Thornvale in restraints, and a sealed formal documentation of everything found at the Oster mill. The iron quantity, the correspondence recovered from the mill's upper room, the names of every man present at the site. Harwick was 60 years old and had the build and the manner of a man who had spent 40 of those years being the kind of military commander that kingdoms were built around. And when he walked into the Crown Council chamber with that documentation in his hands, the room's temperature changed. Drever was detained before the ninth bell. Not by palace household guards, by Harwick's own officers, which was the specific institutional choice that mattered. Military detention rather than palace detention, a chain of custody that ran through Harwick's command and not through any structure that Drever had spent 5 years working inside. Lord Brennig's accounts were frozen by council order before midday. Lady Cassiel and Torvin Alde were detained separately by the afternoon. Serafina was present for none of it directly. She sat in the council session and gave her deposition. 3 hours of dates, names, amounts, and cross-references delivered from memory with the consistency of a woman reciting something she had rehearsed 10,000 times, because she had. She answered every question. She referenced every source. She did not perform certainty she didn't have, and she did not soften anything she did have. And when it was finished, Lord Chancellor Barrett sat back in his chair with the expression of a man who had just watched someone build a cathedral out of pure recollection. Vane corroborated 14 of the specific claims from his own records. Harwick's documentation corroborated 11 more. The council deliberated for 2 hours. She was in her chambers when Aldrich came to find her. Late afternoon. The light through the window had gone the color of cold amber, the specific light of a winter day ending. She had eaten something, finally, bread and cold meat that Dessa had brought without being asked, and she was sitting at the writing desk, not writing anything, just sitting, her hands flat on the surface of the desk, the lamp unlit because the afternoon light was still sufficient. He knocked. She told him to come in. He looked like a man who had aged something in the past 24 hours, not physically, or not only physically, but in the way that certain events age a person's understanding of themselves and that aging shows in how they hold their own face. He sat in the chair across from her desk without being asked. They looked at each other. "Drever is in military custody," he said. "Farrick will be tried before the full council. Brennick has already sent a petition asking to negotiate terms, which tells you everything you need to know about what he thinks is in those records." She nodded. "The council has voted to revoke Farrick's title pending trial," he continued, "and to open a formal review of every contract and appointment Drever was involved in for the past 5 years. "Good," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "They want to offer you a formal position on the council. Not as queen consort, as a voting member in your own right." She looked at him. "Barrett proposed it," he said. "It passed 12-2. She sat with that for a moment. Not the triumph of it. She was too tired for triumph, and triumph had never been what she was after, not in the way the word usually meant. What she was sitting with was the specific weight of a thing finally becoming what it should have been a long time ago, and the question of what to do with the time between what it should have been and what it was now. "I'll accept it," she said. He nodded. Did not look relieved exactly. Looked like a man who understood that acceptance and forgiveness were not the same thing, and who had enough self-knowledge left after everything to not ask for the second when he had only earned the first. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask. When you said it in the council room, that my activities were known to you." She held his gaze. "Did you know, or did you decide to say you knew?" He looked at the desk surface for a moment, then back at her. "I decided," he said. She had known that. She had known it in the room. She was asking because the difference mattered, and she needed him to say it plainly rather than let it become one of the comfortable untruths that had accumulated between them over 7 years until the weight of them was indistinguishable from the floor. "Then that's where we start," she said. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has been handed something he expected to be withheld and isn't yet sure what to do with having it. "Not forgiveness," she said, reading his face. "Not today. Maybe not for a long time. But where we start." He nodded. Once. It was enough. But 3 weeks later, at the formal deposition session the Lord Chancellor had convened in full protocol, Serafina Valamont stood before the Crown Council of Thornvale and delivered the complete account of 7 years of documented corruption within the royal court. She spoke for 4 hours. She named 43 individuals, cited 112 specific transactions, described 11 distinct schemes, ranging from the grain contract skimming to the iron stockpile at Oster to a decade-long pattern of treasury manipulation that had been running before Drever arrived, and that Drever had simply organized and scaled. When she finished, the room was silent for a long time. Then Bered said, "The record will reflect the full testimony of Her Majesty Queen Serafina Valamont, delivered under formal protocol on this date." The record reflected it. In the months that followed, the work was not dramatic. It was the other kind. The kind that doesn't make for clean stories, but that determines what a place becomes when the emergency is over, and the people who are still standing have to decide what they're building. The stolen treasury funds were traced through 4 different merchant houses and partially recovered. The provincial governors whose cooperation Serafina had been cultivating for 2 years were brought into a restructured advisory network that gave the regions actual representation in Crown decisions for the first time in 3 generations. The contracts Drever had managed were reviewed one by one, a process that took 8 months and implicated 7 additional minor lords who had been taking cuts. They hadn't been large enough to be worth pursuing initially. Brennick negotiated his terms and received a reduced sentence in exchange for full financial restitution and testimony against the 2 men above him in the chain. Bark Thornvale was tried before the full council, convicted of treason, and stripped of his title and lands, which were returned to Crown administration. Drever refused to speak in his own defense and was sentenced to permanent exile from the kingdom, a sentence that Serafina had not requested but did not oppose. She had been asked by Bered and by 2 council members separately whether she wanted Drever executed. She had said no, not from mercy exactly, from the specific understanding that a dead man becomes a symbol that other men can use, while an exiled man becomes a cautionary fact, a story that exists in the world rather than in imagination, that can be pointed to and named and verified, and that carries its weight forward in time as evidence rather than myth. She was building something, and she needed the foundation to be made of facts. On the day her formal position on the Crown Council was officially recorded, not announced, recorded, which was the part that mattered because announcements could be walked back and records were permanent. She sat in the chamber after the other members had filed out and looked at the long dark table and the empty chairs. Dessa appeared in the doorway. "Ready?" she said. "In a minute." Dessa waited. Serafina sat in the quiet room and thought about a woman who had arrived in this kingdom 7 years ago believing that respect was a thing that was given to people who deserved it, and who had learned the harder version of that lesson. That respect was a thing you built in the spaces where no one was watching, built out of information and patience and the willingness to survive conditions that were designed to make survival feel like the wrong choice. She thought about the specific texture of being underestimated. Not the insult of it, which she had stopped feeling somewhere in the 5th year. The utility of it. The way contempt created a particular kind of invisibility that was its own resource, if you were disciplined enough to use it rather than waste it on the reaction they were waiting for. She thought about Casto Thornvale's face at the winter feast, the grin with too many teeth, the goblet raised, the specific confidence of a man who had never once been made to feel the cost of what came out of his mouth. Casto had been among the 43 names in her deposition. His role was smaller than his brother's, more opportunistic than strategic, and the council had given him a formal censure and the confiscation of 2 properties rather than trial. She had let that pass. It was the right proportional response, and proportionality was not weakness. It was the demonstration that the standard being applied was consistent rather than personal. She thought about Aldrich. Who was still the king? Who sat in the council sessions with an attentiveness he had not had before? the attentiveness of a man learning to hear things he had spent years not quite listening to. It was not transformation. She did not believe in transformation that arrived whole and complete. It was adjustment, the smaller, less elegant, more honest kind of change that happened when a person looked at what their choices had cost and decided to recalculate. They were not what they had been in the early years. They were not what they had become in the middle years either. They were something she did not have a word for yet, which felt right. The right word for it would probably arrive later, after more time had passed and more of the work was done, and she was content to let it arrive on its own schedule. She thought about the blue ledger. Still in Drever's possession, wherever he was in his exile, still encoded in her cipher. She did not need it back. Everything in it existed in other forms now, in formal council records, in Harwick's military documentation, in the testimonies of men who had decided that speaking was survivable after all. The ledger had done its job before it was taken. It had been the spine of her thinking for 7 years, the discipline of putting a thing into writing, making it more real than it would have been as memory alone. She had built her mind into the shape of that document, and when the document was gone, the shape remained. She stood up from the table, crossed to the door. Dessa fell into step beside her in the corridor, and they walked the way they always walked. The queen and the woman who had moved through this palace like she didn't exist so that Serafina could exist more fully. And the corridor was quiet around them. "The governor's meeting is next week," Dessa said. "I know. Barrett wants to discuss the tax restructuring proposal before then. Tell him tomorrow morning, my chambers, not his office." "And the letter from Aldenmere?" She paused fractionally. "Which one?" "Your mother." She had known it was her mother without asking. The letters from Aldenmere had resumed 3 months ago, after years of careful silence on both sides. Her mother's silence, the silence of a woman watching her daughter from a distance and waiting to see what she became, and her own silence, the silence of a woman who was not yet sure what she had become and did not want to speak it prematurely. "I'll read it tonight," she said. She walked the rest of the corridor without speaking, and Dessa did not push because Dessa understood the difference between the silences that wanted interrupting and the silences that were working. The evening light was coming through the window at the corridor's end. Winter had softened slightly in the past week. Not warmth yet, but the particular quality of cold that is beginning to consider what comes after itself. She stopped at the window and looked out at the courtyard below. The same courtyard she had watched from the east corridor window on the night of the winter feast, watching carriages arrive, watching breath fog and cold air, watching the social choreography of a court that had spent 7 years believing it understood her. The courtyard was quiet now, a stable hand crossing with a bucket, 2 guards on the far wall in unhurried conversation. The ordinary life of a place doing its ordinary work. She had not destroyed this kingdom. She had wanted to in certain moments, in the specific moments when the contempt was freshest and the patience was hardest and the calculation felt less like strategy and more like endurance for its own sake. In those moments, the destruction had presented itself as a simpler answer, a cleaner line. She had not taken it, not from mercy, not from weakness, from the understanding that a destroyed thing produces rubble, and rubble is not what she had been building toward. She had been building toward something that would still be standing after she was gone, something that would exist in the permanent record the way her deposition now existed in the permanent record, verifiable, referenced, impossible to quietly make disappear. A legacy did not require a monument. It required a standard applied consistently, over time, by people who had been given a reason to believe the standard was real. She turned from the window. "Send Barrett confirmation for tomorrow morning," she said. "And tell the governor's secretariat that I want the provincial tax records on the table before the meeting, not during it. I want time to read them first." "Already requested," Dessa said. Of course she had. Serafina looked at her for a moment. This woman who had moved through 7 years of this palace with ink-stained fingers and the ability to become invisible in any room, who had carried the ledger through the dark and been in Petra Solin's shop when the panel was found and sat in an archive room for 20 minutes, not knowing what was happening, and still come out the other side with the message delivered and the network held as far as it could be held. "Dessa," she said, "Your Majesty. When the restructuring is done, the provincial advisory system, the council representation, The contract review. I'm going to need someone to run the coordination office. Not a secretary. Someone who can read a room the way you read a room and move through a palace the way you move through a palace. Dessa was quiet for a moment. That's a significant offer, she said. Yes, Serafina said. I know what it is. Dessa looked at her with the specific expression she wore when she was processing something she had not let herself expect. I'll think about it, she said. Serafina almost smiled. You've already decided. I'll think about it, Dessa said again, but something in her voice had shifted to the particular tone of a woman who has already decided and is giving herself the dignity of a moment before she says so. They walked on down the corridor. Behind them, the window held the last of the evening light, and below it the courtyard was quiet, and the kingdom was imperfect and unfinished, and in the long, slow process of becoming something better than what it had been. Not because the right people had won, but because the right questions were finally being asked in rooms where the answers would be written down and kept. Serafina Valamont walked toward her chambers with the letter from her mother waiting on the desk, and the work of tomorrow already beginning in her mind, and she carried nothing dramatic in her face, no triumph, no exhaustion, no visible mark of what the years had cost. Only the expression of a woman who had known from the beginning that the story did not end with the fall of a corrupt dynasty. It ended with what you built after. And she had only just begun to build.